This video is brought to you by Noom. If you have 10 minutes a day and want to get serious about better eating habits, it's time to give Noom a try. More on them in a bit. It's a story that has become legendary, one that every American is taught at a young age. Less than a week after the long and bloody Civil War effectively came to an end, the man who has become perhaps America's most beloved president, Abraham Lincoln, was shot to death while watching a play. The man who shot him was not a Confederate soldier or a politician, but rather an actor who wasn't even from the South, yet somehow became enamored with their cause. The group that he assembled hoped to plunge the North into chaos and revive Southern hopes for independence. In this, they failed, but in killing Lincoln, they irrevocably changed the course of American history, and the nation is still dealing with the fallout from the assassination today. So who was John Wilkes Booth? What would cause this young man from Maryland, who had already built a prosperous career for himself on the stage, to become so devoted to the cause of Southern nationhood that he would attempt to topple the federal government? How did he get close enough to Lincoln to shoot him? What happened after he did? And could his infamous act have been prevented? When Junius Brutus Booth immigrated to the United States in 1821, he was already a famous stage actor in London. He brought scandal with him to America, as he had abandoned his wife and young son and instead brought his mistress, Mary Ann Holmes, with him. He introduced her to everyone as his wife, and the scandal was soon forgotten as Junius Booth went on to become America's most famous actor, specializing in Shakespearean tragedies like Richard III, Julius Caesar, and Hamlet. John Wilkes Booth was born on May 10, 1838, at the Booth family home in Bel Air, Maryland. His father, Junius, was never home, constantly touring, and when he was, his alcoholism and erratic behavior made life difficult for his large family. He was sent to well-regarded boarding schools, but was an indifferent student, much to the chagrin of his instructors. Junius Booth died in 1852 when John was only 14. He decided soon afterwards to become an actor himself, following in the footsteps of older brothers Junius Jr. and Edwin. Edwin Booth was becoming a household name himself and was able to help his brother break into the theater. His first performance was in 1855 in Baltimore, and after an initial rocky start of enduring stage fright and forgetting his lines, soon he settled into a career as an actor. He became just as famous as his brother and father, gaining a reputation for stealing scenes that he was in, and his charisma and good looks made him enormously popular with the nation's young women. By the end of the 1850s, he was a wealthy man, earning over $20,000 a year, over $500,000 in today's terms, and he was touring all over the nation as a leading man. Just as Booth was coming into his own as an actor, it seemed the country was on the verge of tearing itself apart. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 sparked fears throughout the southern states that their right to own slaves would be infringed on by the new administration. They announced their intention to leave the Union, to secede, and form their own nation, which they called the Confederate States of America. Lincoln held that the southern states had no right to leave the Union, and their state governments were rebelling against federal authority, and he called for the raising of an army to stop them. In April 1861, the first shots of the American Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Booth's home state of Maryland found itself in a difficult position. Maryland was one of the 4 slave-holding states that didn't join the Confederacy, known as border states. Public opinion among Marylanders was sharply divided, even among families. Edwin Booth was a staunch Unionist, while John Wilkes Booth was a passionate advocate for the Southern cause. The Maryland state government tried to hedge its bets by voting to remain in the Union, but also to prohibit federal troops from passing through the state or being based there. This would have made prosecution of the war impossible for the North and left the federal capital of Washington, D.C. exposed to Confederate troops across the river in Virginia. Lincoln wasn't having it. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, specifically in this case the right to not be imprisoned without trial, and jailed many Maryland state leaders at Fort McHenry and Baltimore Harbor. He also imposed martial law on the city of Baltimore and other parts of the state, and effectively occupied Maryland with federal troops for the duration of the war. This outraged many pro-Southern Marylanders, including Booth, who called Lincoln a tyrant. John Wilkes Booth had been involved in politics since 1854, when he campaigns for the Know Nothing Party, an early nativist movement whose major campaign planks were anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. He was a passionate supporter of both the institution of slavery and of the Confederacy, and spoke to everyone he knew about his views. By contrast, his brother Edwin refused to tour in the South and spoke out against the Confederacy. The two brothers argued with each other on the subject so viciously that they eventually stopped speaking to each other. Booth had promised his mother when the war began that he would not enlist as a soldier, so he continued to tour across both the North and the South as a celebrated actor, though he increasingly began to hate himself for his decision, writing in a letter to his mother that he felt like a coward and despised his own existence. In 1864, the war began to turn badly against the Confederacy. In Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army was pinned down in Petersburg, losing men that it couldn't afford to replace, while in Georgia, William T. Sherman's army had captured the city of Atlanta and begun a campaign of destruction in the Deep South. It seems increasingly likely that Lincoln would be re-elected, and if so, it was only a matter of time until the South was defeated and slavery was abolished. Booth felt increasingly frustrated at his own helplessness to prevent this from happening and began to channel his rage towards the person of Abraham Lincoln himself. In a conversation with his sister Asia, he said of Lincoln, "That man's appearance, his pedigree, his coarse, low jokes and anecdotes, his vulgar smiles and his policy are a disgrace to the seat he holds. He has made the tool of the North to crush out slavery." Something snapped within him, and he decided that he was going to do something about it. And hey, if you want to do something about your dietary habits, it's time to talk about today's video sponsor, Noom. I know, look, it's a new year, so a lot of you out there probably have health and fitness goals. Lighten up on the late night ice cream or lose 20 pounds by the summer. The usual stuff. And maybe you're in the market for a high-quality weight loss tool that assists in those goals. But Noom goes way beyond your typical expectations for a weight loss regimen. Some programs will make you track your calories or force you to eat their special meals or do daily maths or shame you for enjoying bad foods. Noom doesn't do any of that. Instead, it takes a more holistic approach to health, providing you with the knowledge and counsel you need to make good dietary choices. That's because getting healthy and losing weight are a whole lot easier if you know how and why you make the decisions you do when it comes to food. And beyond the health content, there are tons of other perks that Noom can give you as well. If you're interested, looking to flex your newfound knowledge with some healthy recipes, Noom has a bunch to share with you. Or maybe you're looking for some personalized attention. Well, set yourself up with one of Noom's dietary coaches. This is a comprehensive program that puts you on the path to healthy success. So if you want to count points, well, buy a calculator. But if you want to develop real healthy eating habits, check out our friends at Noom. There is a link in the description below. Contrary to what many people think, Booth did not start out intending to assassinate the president. He had an even more ambitious plan in mind. He would kidnap Lincoln and take him to Richmond. Once there, he would ransom the president back to the North in exchange for Confederate prisoners held in northern prison camps, both demoralizing the North and providing the South with desperately needed manpower to continue the war. Booth gathered around him a group of Confederate sympathizers to help with the kidnapping plot. Prominent among them were John Surratt, a former postmaster and Confederate spy, George Atzerodt, a Prussian immigrant who ran a carriage repair business, Lewis Powell, a Confederate army deserter, and David Herold, a pharmacist's assistant. The conspirators frequently met at the boarding house owned by John Surratt's mother, Mary, whose level of knowledge of and participation in the conspiracy is still debated by historians today. On March 17, 1865, Booth assembled his fellow conspirators on the road outside of Washington, anticipating Lincoln passing through there on his way to a function, planning to seize him and secret him across the Potomac River into Virginia. But Lincoln never turned up. It turned out that he had changed his plans at the last minute and instead attended a reception at the National Hotel in Washington, ironically the same hotel that Booth himself was staying at. A few weeks later, it seemed all over. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, had been captured, and after attempting to escape, Robert E. Lee's army was forced to surrender at Appomattox on April the 9th. For all intents and purposes, the Civil War was over. The plot to kidnap Lincoln no longer had any point to it, and Booth was despondent and filled with rage. His thoughts immediately took a darker turn towards assassination. No one is really sure what Booth's exact motives were in killing Lincoln. It is clear that he hated the president, viewing him as the cause of all the South's misfortunes. But did he plot to murder Lincoln based on dedication to the cause of the South? Perhaps he believed that taking out the head of the federal government would allow the remnants of the Confederacy to reorganize and fight on, since there were still armies in the field. Or were the motivations more personal. He could have hoped to make himself a hero to the South, the man who slew the tyrant as Brutus killed Julius Caesar. He could have wanted to do it merely to spite the North, maybe even to spite his Lincoln-supporting brother Edwin. Or it could have been a combination of all of them. What is known is that on the morning of April the 14th, Booth stopped in at Ford's Theatre in Washington to pick up his mail. Ford's was a popular theatre that had opened 2 years earlier to replace a theatre that had burned down. Booth himself performed there regularly. He learned that President and Mrs. Lincoln were to attend a play there that night, accompanied by the commander of the Union Army, Ulysses S. Grant, and his wife. Booth decided immediately this was a perfect time and place to kill both the president and the general if he could manage it. Booth gathered together his conspirators to lay out his plan. Lewis Powell was to murder the Secretary of State, William Seward, at his home. George Atzerodt would go to the hotel where Vice President Andrew Johnson was staying and assassinate him. And Booth would slip into the presidential box at Ford's Theatre during the play, shoot Lincoln with the single-shot Derringer pistol he had, and then stab Grant with a dagger that he would also be carrying. Booth probably assumed the presidential box would be guarded and thought he could talk his way into an audience with Lincoln by leveraging his fame as an actor. For his part, Lincoln was a fan of Booth's performances and sent invitations to meet him at the White House several times in the past that Booth had turned down. It seems amazing to us now, but in 1865, security precautions for the presidents were almost non-existent. The Secret Service didn't yet exist, and it wouldn't be until 1902 that they were assigned the duty of protecting the president's life. The White House was open to practically anyone who wanted to petition the president, and even in the middle of a civil war, Lincoln had few, if any, bodyguards around him when he went anywhere. Palace guards were thought to be the province of European monarchs, not elected servants of the people. Thus, on the night that Lincoln went to the theatre, he had only one bodyguard, a police officer named John Frederick Parker. General Grant and his wife decided not to go with Lincoln to the play, instead traveling to Philadelphia to spend time with their children. It has been widely reported that Mary Todd Lincoln and Julia Grant didn't like each other, and that was why the Grants didn't go. Whatever the case, the decision likely saved the future president's life. President and Mrs. Lincoln and their guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, arrived at the theatre late, situating themselves in the presidential box with John Frederick Parker guarding the door. The play was stopped as the audience of 1,700, a full house, gave a standing ovation, and the orchestra played Hail to the Chief. The play was a popular comedy, Our American Cousin, that Booth knew by heart. The plan was for all three would-be assassins to strike at the same time, 10 p.m. While he waited, Booth stopped in next door at the Star Saloon, taking a drink of whiskey, perhaps to calm his nerves. Around 10:15, the play was in the middle of its third act. Lincoln had been seen to be enjoying the play, and nobody was paying attention to what was happening behind the presidential box. Booth had gone into the theatre and up the stairs and found nobody outside the door to the presidential box. The policeman, John F. Parker, had left during the intermission to go drinking and wasn't at his post. Booth went into the small anteroom that separated the box from the hallway and barred the door behind him. Now, only one door separated him from the president. He looked through a peephole in the door, alternately described as being cut by Booth himself or by the owner of the theatre sometime earlier for an unrelated purpose, and waited. He knew from experience that the line in the play that caused the biggest audience reaction was coming up, and he would strike then. On stage, the actor Harry Hawk said the line the Booth was waiting for. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dollar-gizing old man-trap." As the whole audience, including President Lincoln, laughed, Booth opened the door to the box, aimed his pistol at the back of Lincoln's head, and fired from point-blank range. The president slumped forward in his chair. Major Rathbone leapt to his feet and made to grab Booth, who dropped his gun and pulled out his dagger, slicing open Rathbone's arm almost to the bone. Undeterred, Rathbone grabbed again at Booth's coat as the assassin attempted to jump from the box to the stage 12 feet below. Booth had to twist away from Rathbone, and in the process, his spur caught on the bunting draped over the front of the presidential box. He awkwardly fell to the stage, breaking his leg. Probably running high on adrenaline, Booth ignored the pain and, with an actor's flair for the dramatic, held his bloody knife up to the audience and yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." It's also the state motto of Virginia. Some witnesses also reportedly heard, "The South is avenged." Then he limped behind the stage and out the back door, stabbed someone that tried to stop him, mounted his horse, and galloped away. Many in the audience initially thought that Booth was part of the play until the First Lady screamed just as Booth was fleeing the scene. As word spread that the president had been shot, the city of Washington fell into chaos. Things got even worse when reports that Secretary Seward had been attacked as well came in. Lewis Powell had arrived at Seward's house in Lafayette Park around the same time as Booth was entering Ford's Theatre. He bluffed his way past the doorman, but not one of Seward's sons, who tried to intercept him. Powell pulled a gun on him, but the gun misfired, so Powell bludgeoned him unconscious with the butt. Then he ran into the Secretary of State's bedroom, wielding a large Bowie knife. Seward was in bed, recovering from a carriage accident 10 days earlier, which had left him with a broken jaw and arm. Powell slashed repeatedly at the secretary's face and neck with the knife, but the splint that the doctor had fixed onto Seward's head to hold his broken jaw in place saved his life, preventing Powell from slicing his jugular vein. Another of Seward's sons, his daughter, and a soldier who served as an attendant struggled with the attacker, and all were stabbed in turn before Powell ran out of the house, cackling and screaming, "I'm mad, I'm mad." He stabbed another passerby before escaping. Everyone Powell attacked would eventually recover, although William Seward would carry the scars from the attack on his face for the rest of his life. As for George Atzerodt, he never even tried to assassinate Vice President Johnson. He made it to the hotel where Johnson was staying, but lost his nerve and got drunk at the bar instead, wandering around the streets of Washington before disposing of his knife in a storm drain. Lincoln was carried from the theater across the street to the home of William Peterson, where he was attended to by a brigade of doctors, including the Surgeon General, but there was nothing they could do. It is likely that even today, with modern medicine, the wound would have been mortal. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April the 15th, surrounded by much of his cabinet. The news spread quickly across the country, causing an outpouring of grief. Vice President Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States at 11 a.m., but the reins of government were now in the hands of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. He began the investigation into the plot before Lincoln had died, essentially running the government from Peterson House. John Wilkes Booth was quickly fingered as the assassin by multiple witnesses in the theater, and he became the most wanted man in America. Booth had bluffed his way out of Washington before the city was put into lockdown and escaped into southern Maryland along with his accomplice David Herold. He hoped that the relatively rural area full of Confederate sympathizers would be the perfect place to hide out while slipping into Virginia, where he expected to be feted as a hero. He and Herold picked up guns and supplies from Mary Surratt's tavern outside the city and then stopped at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, an acquaintance of Booth's, who set his broken leg and gave him a place to sleep. Mudd would later be arrested and sentenced to prison for assisting Booth, though his role in the conspiracy, like Mary Surratt, is hotly debated. Booth and Herold then went to ground, hiding in the swamps on the Virginia-Maryland border. It was there that Booth seemed to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. He was being given newspapers by a man named Thomas Jones, a Confederate spy who lived in the area, and that was how he learned that Stanton had put a $50,000 bounty on his head, a staggering sum for the time. He also learned that most of his co-conspirators had been arrested already, including Atzerodt and Powell, and by April the 21st, the only conspirators still at large were Booth himself, Herold still with Booth, and John Surratt, who had escaped across the border to Canada and then to Europe. He wouldn't be arrested until November 1866. Worse for Booth, he saw that the reaction to his act wasn't all that he hoped for. Far from considering him a tyrant, almost everyone in the North was shocked and appalled at Lincoln's murder, even his fiercest critics. And many people in the South were similarly unimpressed with Booth's act, though some of that may be chalked up to self-preservation. Many in the South feared that an angry Northern population would exact revenge on the South for Lincoln's death. Federal troops were scouring southern Maryland for the assassin, and with no hero's welcome to look forward to, Booth decided to cross into Virginia and continue south, perhaps all the way to Mexico, to escape federal authorities. After getting lost along the way, Booth and Herold made it to Virginia on April the 23rd. They arrived at a farm owned by Richard Garrett, a family that didn't know yet that Lincoln had been assassinated or that Booth was a fugitive. But word got back to Washington about Booth's movements, and a detachment of soldiers led by Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger and Lieutenant Edward Doherty were sent to find Booth and capture him. Conger and Doherty tracked Booth to the Garrett farmhouse and surrounded the tobacco barn they were hiding in shortly before dawn on April the 26th. David Herold quickly surrendered, but Booth refused, saying that he'd prefer to come out and fight. In an attempt to smoke him out, the soldiers set fire to the barn. There are conflicting accounts about what happened next. One of the soldiers, Sergeant Boston Corbett, drew a bead on Booth through a crack in the wall of the barn. Corbett said that Booth raised his gun to shoot Corbett, upon which Corbett fired. Others allege that Corbett fired on an unarmed Booth out of a sense of vengeance, but no one will ever know for sure. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal column and damaging 3 vertebrae. He collapsed to the ground, paralyzed, and was dragged out of the barn by soldiers. Booth was unable to move and in excruciating pain. Over the course of the next 2 hours, he begged the soldiers to kill him. At one point, he asked one of the soldiers to pull up his hand so that he could see them. The soldier complied, and Booth looked at them, muttering, "Useless, useless." They were his last words. Soon after, he died, 2 weeks shy of his 27th birthday. Edwin Stanton had wanted Booth taken alive and initially planned to court-martial Boston Corbett for killing him. But the case was dismissed, and Corbett went on to be known as Lincoln's Avenger by the public. The other conspirators were tried by military tribunal soon afterwards. 4 of them, George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and Mary Surratt, were sentenced to death and were hanged on July the 7th. 4 more were sentenced to prison terms. 1 died in prison, but the other 3 were pardoned by President Johnson shortly before he left office in 1869. John Surratt was never convicted of his role in the plot, and many believed that his mother had been hanged in his place. The consequences of Abraham Lincoln's death had a profound effect on American history. It deprived the country of their leader right when they needed him the most to help heal the nation and bind it back together. Andrew Johnson, a Unionist Southerner, had no interest in making sure the slaves freed during the war were set up for success in the post-war South. His primary interest was in getting the troops out of the former Confederacy as soon as possible and restoring order, meaning control by the antebellum white politicians that had plunged the country into conflict in the first place. It would set him against Congress and most of his own cabinet, and he became the first president to be impeached. He was only saved from being removed from office by a single vote. Without Lincoln, support for freed slaves eventually dried up, and by 1876, when the last of the federal troops were withdrawn, the former Confederate states had enacted so-called Jim Crow laws that segregated black citizens and made it almost impossible for them to exercise any of their civil rights. While it is impossible to say how things would have been different if Lincoln had lived, it is certain that they would have been different, and in all likelihood would have been better for everyone, but especially African Americans. As for John Wilkes Booth, his name, as is the fate of many assassins, is irrevocably tied to that of the great man he slew. What sets Booth apart from people like Lee Harvey Oswald or James Earl Ray is that they were driven in no small part by the compulsion to become famous by killing a famous person. Booth was already famous before assassinating Lincoln, which makes it all the more strange that he would do it. We must accept, however, that it was his fanatical devotion to the cause of the Confederacy and to the preservation of slavery that led him away from the comfortable path laid in front of him and down the dark road that ended with the deaths of both himself and the president that was so beloved by many, yet hated by him. It also seems obvious that if a modicum of protection had been in place, Booth would not have been able to access the presidential box that night, armed as he was, and history would have been much different. But he did, and that is why we consider John Wilkes Booth America's most infamous assassin. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Noom, who I'm linking to below. And thank you for watching.